Grab a Bible, turn to Luke chapter 9. If you don't have a Bible, there's one located under the seat in front of you. Luke chapter 9. We as a church are just going through the book of Luke. It's a process that will take us over a couple of years to finally get through it, but it's exciting because we're learning principles that we probably wouldn't normally focus on. But as you find your place and as you look in the Bible to Luke chapter 9, I want you to kind of for a moment to think hypothetically. What if you were going on a trip? So maybe the trip is far out, maybe something like California, or maybe it's a trip to somewhere closer, like a neighboring state. What would you do as you prepare for that? My guess is you would probably start with figuring out transportation. If it's close enough to drive, you would probably drive. If it was far out, you would probably book your flights. And there's a whole process there that you would go through. You would probably pack some clothes. Now, just for my own curiosity, because you've really learned a lot about people with questions like this, how many of you, when you are going on a trip, you pack at least a week in advance? How many of you? Man, you guys are so strange. How many of you, within a week of your trip, you pack? Okay. I know my assistant, Sherry. She packs weeks in advance, but I remember one day I was going on a trip. I was flying out in the evening, and she said, "Have you packed yet?" And I'm like, "I don't fly out till evening." Like, no, I don't pack yet. I'll pack sometime today. But how many of you packed the night before? Okay, getting more normal. How many of you the day of? Welcome to the family. You guys are the ones. Yeah, each of us have a different system. So we would pack. We would think about the lodging, where we're going to stay. We would think about the budget, how much money we would need. We would think about food. These are logical things to think about when you're planning a trip. Well, the story we look at today, the disciples are going to be sent out by Jesus, but he tells them to do something that on the surface seems illogical. It definitely is not natural, so it's counterintuitive. He tells them to not think about these things. So let's just dive in and read it. Chapter 9. And Jesus called the 12. These were his closest followers, known as the disciples, men who had dedicated their lives to him. So he called the 12 together, and this is what he gave them. He gave them power and authority. So these are spiritual things. Power and authority over demons, over all demons, and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. So it starts with him giving them something. Supernatural power, something they would not have had on their own. But then in verse 3 it says, and he said to them, "Take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics," or like a change of clothes. "And whatever house you enter," so he's like, wherever you go and someone opens up their house, he goes, "Stay there, and from there depart." So don't try to find a better house, just stay there, and from there depart. "And wherever they do not receive you, when you leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet," shake off, "as a testimony against them." Do I have to turn in my man card because I just quoted Taylor Swift? Okay, at the door. I'm going to try to earn it back by the end of the service. "And they departed and went through the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere." So what Jesus asked them to do, how many of you, when you hear that, Jesus saying, "Okay, I'm going to send you out, but don't take any food, don't take extra clothes, don't make any arrangements." How many of you, when you hear that, this gives you the hives? Like you just think, like you're too much of planners. You're like, really? I'm going to do that? And so Jesus asked him not to take these things. Instead, though, he says, "I'm going to give you something. I'm going to give you supernatural, spiritual power to heal, power to have authority over all evil spirits. I want you to go out and proclaim what you're hearing me teach, what you're seeing me do. Go and tell people, but I don't want you to think about the physical." Now, I want you for just a moment to put yourselves in that situation. Can you imagine for me as your pastor if I said, "Hey guys, let's just go out. Let's go start telling people about Jesus. And so I'm going to send you to the surrounding states. I'm going to send some of you west, some of you east, some of you south. I won't send anybody north." Okay, you're prejudiced against Michigan. And so I won't send anyone in that direction. They're already all saved. And I'm from Michigan. I just offended half our visitors. I'm just joking, okay? I'm not getting my man card back anytime soon, am I? It's just staying away. Okay, so we send you out and I say, but don't think about clothing. Don't think about toiletries. Don't think about food. Just go. And what Jesus was doing, to put it in a statement, Jesus sent them out with power and authority, but not with him physically accompany them, so that they would learn that God could provide for them supernaturally. So here's Jesus' strategy. He goes, "Guys, I'm sending you out on a mission, but there's a purpose here. I'm not necessarily setting a precedent so that every follower from this time forward can't prepare, can't take money. We'll look at that in a moment. But he's sending them out because he's saying, I want you to discover this truth, that I will give you everything you need spiritually, and God will provide for you supernaturally everything you need in the physical. Jesus was preparing them because he knew the end game. He knew where he was leading them. He knew how he would ultimately leave them physically on earth and he would send them out to do a supernatural work. But he had to start here. He had to start temporary, a season where he wouldn't physically be with them so that they would learn this truth, that God is able to provide for them physically. And this was a huge step of faith. It's something that required them all to get outside of themselves and to trust in him. But later, he would change that. After they experienced this, he would say, okay, we don't have to continually do this because you've already learned the truth. In Luke chapter 22, something we'll get to in probably a year or so, Luke 22:35, he said to them, so he's like asking them to remember, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, he's like, do you guys remember that? He goes, did you lack anything? And it's like they probably thought about it and they were like, no, nothing. We don't lack anything. He said to him, but now let the one who has a money bag, that's true too. Some of you have the money purses. All right, money bag, take it, and likewise a knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Here's what Jesus just said to him. He goes, guys, you remember before? Like, I want to take you back to that moment. Can you remember how you felt when I sent you out? I sent you out and I said, don't take anything with you. Don't take provision. Don't take money. Don't take extra change of clothes. You remember that? And they're like, yeah. He goes, did you lack anything? Was there ever a moment that you went without? And they thought about it and they're like, no, nothing. But can you imagine how that actually played out? When Jesus sent them out and so they're going and they're like, so where do you want to go? Well, we're going to go to this village and we're going to go to this town. And as they stepped in, they probably thought, we don't know how they're going to receive us. I mean, they might hate us. They might reject us. If we're hungry, I mean, how are we going to eat? So can you imagine when they walked into these villages and people listened to them? And then the first person to come to them and say, hey, are you guys hungry? Can I get you lunch? Can I provide dinner for you? And they're like, sure. And then the next person who said, hey, you probably don't have a place to stay. You want to stay at my house? And they're like, yeah. And as they went through this process, there had to have been a moment where they realized Jesus provided everything we would need. And there had to be that moment where they crossed over and Jesus goes, you remember that? Yeah. And they're like, yeah, we do. That was amazing. He goes, yeah, you don't have to always do that. As you look toward the future, you can plan, you can take money, but you've learned this principle. I will give you everything you need spiritually, and you can trust God to provide for you physically. Because later on, Jesus knew where he was going. He was going to eventually leave them, physically leave them, and he wanted them to hold fast to this truth. In Luke 24, these are the last recorded words that Jesus gave to the disciples before he ascended into heaven. So this is after his death, his resurrection. He spent 40 days with them, and he says this. Then Jesus opened their minds to understand the scriptures and said to them, so he's quoting what has already happened, thus it is written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. So he says, guys, I'm about to send you out now to all nations. He tells them, you are witnesses of these things. And behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you. But stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high. Once again, this is the end game. He prepared them by giving them supernatural power and saying, trust in God. And now he's saying, guys, once again, I'm leaving, but I'm not just sending you out to the surrounding villages and towns. I'm sending you guys around the world. I'm sending you far out, but I'm not leaving you. I'm giving you supernatural, spiritual power. The same thing is recorded in the Great Commission, Matthew's account of the same conversation. He says, and Jesus came and said to them, again, starts with power, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. You know what's ironic about that passage? Jesus goes, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. And then he ascends into heaven. You know, the disciples were like, wait. What did he just say? I heard him wrong. What did he just say? As he goes in heaven. But what he was saying was he was going to send his spirit to not just be with them, but to be in them. Again, it's not just to the villages. He's going, I'm now commissioning you to go out, but you've already lived this truth out. You already know that what you need spiritually will be provided and what you need physically will be provided. See, Jesus is always doing three things in all of our lives. For those who have put their faith in Jesus, he's doing these three things. For you that haven't yet, he's still drawing you to the first one. But the three things that Jesus is always doing is he's drawing us into a deeper relationship with him. I mean, the disciples, as they were being sent out, they had no idea what was going on. But can you imagine the emotion in their hearts as they started to see God supernaturally move on their behalf? As the first person offers them lunch, and the next person offers them dinner, and the person offers them a place to stay, there had to be a point where they went, oh my goodness, Jesus, he's providing for us now. He's not even physically with us, but what he said is true. There had to be a moment where their closeness just got deeper and deeper. And when they came back, can you imagine what happened? I mean, we have an account of it. When they came back and Jesus was like, so how did it go? And they're like, it was incredible. I mean, they were pumped. They're like, the demons obeyed us and it was incredible. And sick people were healed and they were celebrating with Jesus because their faith had grown in trust. And Jesus is doing this with them and he's doing it with us. He's trying to get us to trust him more so that our relationship will go deeper. Because every important relationship in our lives is rooted in trust. Every relationship you have, if the trust factor is broken, that relationship will never get deeper. But the more you can trust a person, the deeper you'll get in a relationship. And so Jesus is always drawing us. The second thing he's always doing is using us for his purpose. And I don't mean that in a take advantage sort of way. But it's not just about us. So it's about us, but it's not just about us. See, he sent the disciples out to do his ministry, but he was doing something unique in their lives, but he was also doing something unique through their lives. He sent them out to heal people, to cast out demons, to proclaim the message of Jesus Christ. So not only were they growing in faith and learning to trust God, but in that same moment, his ministry was being spread through all the surrounding communities. Don't you just love that dynamic? God works in us and through us in the same moment. But here's the third thing that God always does, is he's always preparing us for something greater. And the disciples had no idea that in this first moment, this first season where he sent them out, that God knew that eventually he was going to send them out into all the world. This was something greater. He was preparing that for them. They had no idea, but he knew that he was going to give them purpose steps that they needed to take so that at the moment where he was leaving them physically to ascend to heaven, that they would be fully prepared to accomplish something greater. And when we look at this list here on the screens, on all your screens, I want us to say something clearly. This is only accomplished if you're willing to take steps of faith. If you're willing to take steps that get you out of your comfort zone. Because the more you do things uncomfortable to you, where you trust in God, the more he can work in your heart. See, you will not draw closer to Jesus if you don't trust him. You will not be used by Jesus to bless others if you don't trust him. And you will not be prepared for something greater if you don't trust him. All of these steps require steps of faith. And so Jesus took the disciples through that, but he does the same thing in our lives. And I want to show you a simple, just a visual illustration of this principle. See, the first step that all of us are called to in our lives is the step of salvation. Some of you are here and you haven't made this step yet. And you're here because maybe someone invited you to see baptism. Maybe you're just checking out Christianity, so you're just open. You're seeking. Maybe you're doubting. Maybe you are a believer. You're here. Everyone's represented. But this is the first step that Jesus calls us to. But once you make this step to trust into him, he doesn't leave you there. You see, for all of us, Jesus has a perfect plan that's going to lead us somewhere else. Salvation is the beginning, not the end of the story. Salvation is when we enter into a relationship, but he wants to guide us somewhere else. But the only way to get us to the place that he has for us, we have to be willing to take steps of faith. And so what Jesus does is he gets us out of our comfort zone by placing steps in front of us. And so I want to give you just some hypothetical. These are ones that I've gone through personally. I've seen others go through. Your story might be a little bit different, but let's just do some hypothetical steps. So once you're saved, maybe the first step God gives you is behavior modification. That's where you get saved and you all of a sudden start to look at your life and you realize there's some things that probably need to change. Like maybe you look at your life and you go, I realize I'm not that patient of a person. Maybe you're like, you know what? I just need to cuss less, okay? Like I just find myself being foul and I don't think that honors God, and so I'm going to swear less. Maybe it's just to be more patient. Maybe you look around and you think, you know what? I have a tendency to tell people off, and that probably doesn't represent Jesus, and so I just want to modify that. Maybe it's the books that you read, the music you listen to. You go, you know, this music, as I really evaluate it, it doesn't lead me toward God. It messes with my mood. It puts other things in my head. Or maybe it's the TV shows you watch, the websites you go to, the movies you attend. You look at it and you go, okay, I just need to change this. I'm realizing God is calling me to behavior modification. But you look at that and you go, man, but that step is difficult because I like cussing people out. Some people just need to be told off, doggone it, you know? And maybe you're like, you know what, it's just hard. I've listened to that music. I've watched these movies. I get entertained by that. And is it really that big of a deal? And you feel like Jesus is pulling you and tugging you, and you have that step, and you go, man, I'm uncomfortable with this. This requires faith, but I'm going to do it. I'm just going to take that step of faith. And so you step out, and you take that step, and you realize there's benefit to it. And God shows you his truth, and he confirms that in your life. And you're like, okay, now I see the wisdom. I see the wisdom of it. But then God doesn't stop there. He puts the next step in front of us. And maybe the next step for you is forgiveness, where God starts to remind you of some people that you're holding a grudge against. Maybe you've had some really legit people who have hurt you in your life, wounded you, and you know in your mind, you've already made that internal commitment, I'm never going to forgive them. But all of a sudden, Jesus puts that step in front of you. And he says, that's the next step of faith. That's the next step I want you to go to. And you're looking at it and you're going, that's too big of a step. If I forgive them, then they're going to think it's okay to act that way. They're going to think they can get away with it. And I just can't do that. And then you feel the tug of Jesus, and he's pulling on your heart, and he's saying, I forgave you. You got to forgive. This is the best way to experience life. And all of a sudden you have that step. It's a little bit bigger, as you notice, just a little bit bigger. And you're like, I don't know about this, but once again, okay, Jesus, I'm going to trust you. You came through before. I'm going to trust you. And so you take that step, and you realize, well, wow, there is some freedom here. That this was more than just a simple thing. It was a spiritual reality. And now this has changed my heart, and it's changed my perspective of everything. And so you're standing on this new step, and then all of a sudden Jesus says, here, let me give you another one. And maybe the next one has to do with your relationships. Maybe you have some friendships in your life that you just know are unhealthy. You're going in this direction, and they're going in that direction, and God's telling you, you know what? It's going to be easier for them to pull you down than it is for you to pull them up. You need to create some separation, and you think, oh, you got to be kidding me. I mean, these are my people. These are the people that have been faithful to me and loyal to me. And we've had all this experience and all these things that we've gone through together. And you want me to end this relationship? And Jesus is saying, yeah, it'll be best for you. At least for a season maybe. Or maybe you're in a dating relationship and you realize as you got saved, you go, I realize I'm not honoring God in this dating relationship. Maybe you're not treating the person correctly. Maybe you're not honoring God, what he's commanded sexually, and you know the relationship's impure, and God's tugging at your heart saying you need to change that, you need to modify that, and you're thinking, okay, what does that look like? And just the reality that's confusing. We already live together. We have a house together, and there's all these things that have to change, and you're just looking at the step in front of you, and you're going, man, that's a big step. I mean, you want me to do that, Jesus? And he's going, yeah, there's a reason, though. There's a reason I want you to do this. It's going to be better for you in the end. Just trust me. I designed you how to operate. And that step, it's a little bit bigger than the last one, but it's an important step. And so you go, okay, God, doesn't make sense to me. It's going to be super inconvenient. Let's do it. You take that step. And you realize, wow, there's some truth there. And your heart's confirmed. And you go, I see it. I see why this is better this way. And then you get there and you think, okay, great, I've made it. And Jesus says, nope, here's the next step. And the next step in front of you, maybe it's your finances, and you think, you got to be kidding me. First relationships and now finances. And God puts it in front of you and you're like, man, I'm barely breaking even this month. Maybe I'm not even breaking even. Maybe every month I go a little bit more under. And Jesus is saying, here, I want you to trust me. If you will trust me in your finances, I'm going to show you something that I'm able to provide for you better than your job, better than the government, better than yourself. I can provide for you. Because God says, all the silver is mine, all the gold is mine. As Jimmy Evans says, Daddy's rich. Talking about God, not me, God, okay? That God is rich, God can provide, and he tells us that, and we're like, okay, but this doesn't make any sense. I can look at it. I can look at the numbers on the paper. Mr. Budget says no, okay? And God says yes, and you look at that and you think, God, if I step out in faith and you don't catch me, I fall very hard, very fast, and very long. And God says, just trust me. And you take that big step. And God catches you and you're like, wow. Even in that area, now you're this bigger step. You take it and you see God is faithful. And then maybe the next step for you is evangelism. God says, okay, now I want you to tell someone about your faith. And you're like, you got to be kidding me. These people, they know the old me. Any of you ever have that fear? They know the old me. They know the person who was foul. They know the person who was aggressive, the impatient person. They know the partier. You want me now to go to these same people and start to tell them about my faith? And then you go, but what if they ask me a question that I can't answer? And that's always everyone's fear. What if they ask me a Bible question, I don't know the answer, or they have all these facts they want to throw at me, and I don't know how to defend it? And God says, don't worry about that. All I want you to worry about is that you need to be ready and willing to give an account of the hope that you have what God has done in your life. And you're like, oh man, I have to tell my brother this, I have to tell my sister this, my parents, they know everything about me. And you go, okay, once again, I'll take that step of faith. And you take that step of faith and God catches you. And you're like, wow, once again, I realize he is faithful. And then God says, okay, now here's the next big step. This is where I wanted to get you. Maybe the next step for you is some type of ministry. Maybe it means a radical transformation in your life. Again, this is my story, so these are the steps that God took me through. But when you get to ministry, where God says, I know, Matt, you're heading in that direction. He told me you're now going to head in this direction. But what happens if God does that to you? Where he says, okay, I know you went to college for this degree. I know you have this job. I want you to do something different. And you go, man, that's a huge step. But all of a sudden you go, but wait a second, that's a huge step. But when I think back, he was faithful. 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 And all of a sudden, you're willing to take this step because you took the steps prior to this. And this is what God is doing in all of our lives. Remember, he's doing three things in each of our lives. The first one is he's trying to draw each of us into a deeper relationship of trust. See, every time you take a step and Jesus catch you, you realize his power and love, right? You take a step that you know in the physical, if I don't have anyone involved supernaturally, if I take this step in the physical, it ends badly. So you take that step and God catches you, all of a sudden you go, man, he's powerful. And man, he's loving. That he would care about me. David in the scriptures, I love this passage where he says, who is man that you should care about me? The son of man that you should care. I mean, he's like, David has this moment where he just probably looks up. He's a shepherd at one point. He probably just looks up to the stars and goes, really? You created all of this and you care about me? But God says, yeah, I care about you. And when you take those steps, he's drawn into this relationship. I got you every step of the way. But then the second thing he's doing that we can't lose sight of is he's using these steps that we take for other people, for other situations. So you look at the first one and you go, behavior modification, this is going to be difficult. And so we take this step and we're just thinking about ourselves. But the same moment that we're changing how we think and how we act, our friends and family that know us best, they're looking at our lives and they're going, why are they changing? Why is that person I know that's so aggressive and so angry, why all of a sudden do they have peace? Why are they more patient? Why are they forgiving? And they start to look at you, and all of a sudden, the change in your life that you thought was just about you, all of a sudden, it becomes a shining light. It becomes an example to people around you, and they go, man, and that person, I know what that person did to them, and they forgave them? I mean, they forgave them of that horrible thing they did? How is that possible? I mean, I wouldn't forgive them. That's unheard of. That person, I mean, that was wrong. And they look at you and they're drawn into your story now. And maybe they even come to you and they ask you, why are you doing that? Why are you letting them off the hook? And you're like, Jesus let me off the hook. Jesus changed my heart. And they're like, so this is for real? For real? You know, Jesus does this in your life? And you're like, yeah. And then you go to the next one. And maybe that person that you're so afraid to break that relationship off because you're close. And you think, oh man, I got to make this sacrifice. But what if that is the moment God uses to get their attention? What if that friend or that dating relationship, they so care about you that when they realize you're going in a different direction, they go, you know what, I love that person. So if they're going in that direction, I need to look at that direction. I need to evaluate that. So I'm going to head that way too. And maybe God uses that to save them. See, again, God is always doing something in our lives, but he's using our steps of faith for other people. But then here's the third thing God does that we often lose sight of. He's always preparing something greater for us or preparing us for something greater. But here's the key. We will never know what that is. This is the mystery of faith. Because here's the truth. If God were to tell you at that moment where your life is going to end up, can you imagine that? If you come forward for a salvation call, you're like, I'm giving my heart to Jesus. And I go, okay, here's a book that's going to explain your next 40 years. And you open it, you start looking. You know what all of our response would be? Oh, never mind. And then you would head back to your seat and you'd sit back down. Because to take these huge steps, if we tell you immediately that eventually God's going to ask you to take this huge step into something that you're not comfortable with, many of us wouldn't do it. But God knows to get you from point A to point B, there are many steps of faith in between. And in his perfect planning and perfect love, he has drawn you to take these steps. Just to keep taking them so that he can get you to the place where he knows you're going to experience the fullness of life and he can use you for something greater than you could ever imagine. But here's the temptation for us. We look at these steps individually and think they're not connected. So at times we look at one of the steps that God puts in front of us and we go, okay, that step I'm not comfortable with. That step I can't do. I might get to that later, so I'm just going to put that on the shelf for a while. But God, bring it on. Let's go to the next step. And so let's just say hypothetically we take out forgiveness and we take out finances. And we go, you know what? Those are just two I'm not going to give to God. But God, bring it on. Here's the problem with that logic, is we think they're all individual steps. But they are all steps that lead to the next step that God has for us. So that step that you thought, I can't take that now, that goes away. And now all of a sudden the next step that God has for you, if this step seemed difficult, that step seems impossible. You look at that because God knew by taking this step that I place in front of you, your faith will grow enough that you'll be ready for the next step. But when you don't take it, and for some of you, you're wondering why your relationship with Jesus has stalled, has started to move backwards. It's possible that he set a step in front of you that you went, not going to do that, bring on the next step. And he said, the next step is way out here. You're not ready for it. But when you're willing to go through the process and to take the steps that he placed in front of you, then each step seems doable. See, let's put those back up there for a moment. Here's a simple way to explain this. This is the goal of God. He wants small steps to big steps so that big steps seem normal. You understand that? He wants you to go from small steps to big steps so that big steps eventually seem normal to you. See, this is for all of our lives. For those who have done exercising, you remember the first time you got out when you were out of shape. It just felt horrible. You know, I've heard this testimony. You run for a little bit, you feel like you're going to die. You feel like death is chasing you behind you. You're looking behind you, you know. And then you get used to that. And eventually, so that first time you run a mile, you think you're going to die. You get in shape. Eventually, running a mile is nothing. It's a warm-up. That big step now seems normal. It's not a big deal. And what God is trying to get all of us is to go from small steps to big steps so that eventually big steps will seem normal. And here's the reason why. This is what the whole message is based on. Because when big steps seem normal, you're ready for anything that God will call you to do. Do you hear me on that? See, this big plan that God has for your life, he's leading you in very purpose steps to get to this place. And when you get to the place in your life where big steps are normal, where God puts out something in front of you and you go, huge step, he's always been faithful, let's do it. You step out. When you get to that place, you're ready for anything that God would have for you. And this is his goal for all of our lives. Because he knows the deeper we get in faith and trust, the deeper we will get into his love and power. So here's the question for you today. What's the step in front of you right now? What's the step that Jesus has placed in front of you right now? For many of you, it's still here. It's still salvation. You might be here today, and you might be here, like I said earlier, because someone dragged you. Maybe you have to be here. And you're kind of circling this decision, and you're thinking, I don't know what I have to do and all that. And I realize this was a horrible sales pitch if it was, because I'm telling you, let me warn you, it's going to end here. It's going to end somewhere else. But I'll tell you, it's the best decision you'll ever make. If you'll make that step of faith to say, Jesus, I don't understand it all. I don't know how my life's going to change, but I realize you're good. I realize you're good enough that you came down and died for my sins and you were resurrected. That's enough for me to trust you. I'm just going to take this step of faith. That first step, if you'll take it, it'll be the greatest decision you have ever made in your life. Here, let me prove it to you. How many of you, that was the greatest decision you've ever made in your life? These people aren't lying. This is the reality of their lives. But for you who have already made that step, what's the next step in front of you? I know we all have it, right? We all have that next step that Jesus is putting in front of us, and we all do. I mean, I hope you know this as a pastor. I hope I never try to be at all pretend, faking it in front of you. I just hope I never do that. I hope you know that in my life, there's constantly the next step in front of me that are still difficult. I mean, I still have the moments where I'm like, you want me to do what? I mean, I have that all the time. Okay, that seems out of my comfort zone. Let's do it, God, and take that step. So what's the next step in front of you? And will you trust Jesus so that you can take that step so he can prepare you for the next step and the next step so he can guide you into greater things? Will you do me a favor and bow your heads? I want to ask a simple question that I often do when I teach. By a show of hands, how many of you have a step of faith that Jesus has placed in front of you that you're nervous to take and you just want prayer? Will you raise your hand high real quick? Yeah, I mean, the whole room is full of hands. You can put your hands down. Let me pray for you. Jesus, I'm so thankful that you care enough about us individually to challenge us to take new steps. I mean, it's just such a humbling thought that you're not just a distant God. You're an intimate God. You know our fears. You know what we're afraid to do. You know the plan that you have for us. You know where you're trying to guide us. And you care enough to place those steps in front of us. Thank you so much for that. But you also know, because you came down and lived as a man, you know the struggle that we have. You says in your word that in all ways you were tempted just like man so that you could be a more faithful high priest. So you know the fear that we have. You know the step in front of us. We intellectually understand that you're good, but the step still scares us, still terrifies us. So we're asking for your Holy Spirit to empower us to trust you, for your Holy Spirit to give us that courage to walk in obedience so that we can experience the fullness of the life you've designed us to live. Help us to trust you in whatever that step is. Not worrying about the future, just worrying about that step. And Lord, I'm asking, once we take that step, confirm it immediately in our hearts that you're faithful, that you're good, that you're powerful, and that you are loving. And Jesus, we're excited to see where you lead us. And we pray all this in your powerful and precious name. Amen.